continuation of what Barb and Tammy started us off with this morning. And our hope is that what we talk about and move through today will be very practical and applied. Hopefully you'll leave with some more confidence in how you might move forward with developing your research project, but also hopefully you will have completed some preliminary work in thinking about what steps you might take and what different sort of level of thoughtfulness and thinking needs to go into shaping your research project. So we'll talk about, here's the plan. We're going to talk a little bit about how big your question is. So we touched on this morning, talking about small R versus big R research, but different kinds of questions beg different kinds of responses. So we'll spend a little bit of time just exploring that, and maybe we'll ask for you to share some of your examples, and we can just get a sense from the group. And I'll really encourage us to offer our collective knowledge and feedback to each other as examples are brought forward, because really as a collective group, and for those of you too in your rooms and that are joining us remotely, you bring a tremendous wealth of knowledge to the room, and that you might not even recognize how much you bring to your research project already. So please feel free to share that knowledge and experience as we move through these. So we'll talk about how big the question is. We'll spend a bit of time talking about scoping your study. This is language I borrowed from my husband's work, who's a transportation engineer. They always scope their projects. And they spend a lot of time scoping. But actually, it's really valuable to do that scoping because it determines the steps and phases that you go through. So we'll scope some studies. We'll talk about elements of a research proposal, what kinds of diversity is available in funding, and the range of funders that you could apply to. And I've hyperlinks into the slide for that, so that maybe we can select one topic and just look at one or two funding agencies and what a call might look like in that. So we'll look at that, and then we'll have a bit of time for a reflective wrap-up at the end. And throughout the whole process, Linda's going to offer a really concrete example of some research that's evolved over about five different studies or so. There's more even, over a period of years. So I'll talk a little bit about this.
Great, thanks, Katrina. So we thought the example around the integration of nurse practitioners into British Columbia, and particularly into interior health, might serve as a nice example of how a research program has actually grown from the time the NPs were first introduced in 2005. And when I started on this journey, I really wasn't looking at myself as becoming a researcher. I was working in an admin position at the time, and I signed up for the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation Extra Fellowship, which I mentioned earlier this morning, a 2-year fellowship looking at evidence-informed decision-making in the healthcare system. And part of that 2-year program was identifying a problem or a project that we were going to work on, and really demonstrating how we were going to use evidence to inform the decision-making around that project. So that's how it all began. And I was telling Katrina this morning, Barb and Tammy talked a lot about your problem statement. And in the extra fellowship, we worked with faculty from across Canada and the US, and they helped us at all of the various stages of our projects. I must have spent 25 hours with different faculty members trying to get a problem statement that made sense, was researchable, and was going to work for what it was I was trying to do. Because again, I wasn't starting out to do research. I was starting out to do an intervention in the organization informed by the best evidence. So I was sharing with Katrina this morning, and I'll share with you just quickly the problem statement, and this is actually from my final presentation. So this is after I had people like John Lavis and others who are well known in the research world help me try to make this a concise problem statement. So I apologize, but here's what it was. So the problem statement was lack of consensus regarding the value of nurse practitioners working in collaboration with other healthcare professionals to improve access, and enhance continuity and coordination of care for patients living with multiple chronic diseases. So I think I probably had about 8 different problems within that statement. But interestingly, that was agreed as kind of what I hoped to work on. And as we go through the 7 years later, 5, 6, 7 studies later, I think we've sort of tackled different aspects of that problem statement.
So, how big is your question? With any question that we can formulate, so we spent some time talking about problem statements and starting to look at questions. Different kinds of questions are always going to beg different kinds of teams, methods, resources, and proposals. So, as we formulate the question, as you come to really get your mind around what it is you are trying to ask, your question will shape all of the different steps you'll take next. So, for example, if you have a question, what would be, I'll ask to put it to you, what would be a difference that might lean you more towards quantitative than a qualitative question about nurse practitioners or about one of the studies or ideas that came up this morning?
Well, a qualitative question might be why. Quantitative question might be how much.
Yes.
So
good.
why would we employ nurse practitioners in interior health? How much cost savings would we have in rural and remote nursing by having a collaborative team which employ a nurse practitioner?
Yeah, so even the first question, the first word in your question, why or how much, or how versus how much, might lend itself to a very different looking study. So right away, your question is going to shape the sort of broad branch of research you're going to go down. And even then within, especially in qualitative, so it's going to shape in detail what methodology you design for your research. It's also going to shape the kind of team you need to pull together, because different kinds of quantitative studies might require a statistician and others may not. Some might require statisticians with specific expertise in cost-effectiveness analysis, whereas others might require statisticians with logistic regression expertise. And qualitative, you might require a mixed group. Say you're doing critical ethnography, was the example that Barb used. You might need experts in both critical approaches and ethnography, depending on who you have available. The scale of your study, the length of time, the nature of it, whether it's longitudinal or whether it's retrospective, all of these things will affect the resources that you need to put into it. And a research study might vary in resources required, from being time of people already in paid positions that we don't require a grant for, similar to the action research study that I'm facilitating. Or it might require millions of dollars over a longer period of time. I ask you to take out your worksheet. This is developing your research project workshop, pre-proposal worksheet. And I'm going to just kind of, Linda and I are going to kind of play the role of interviewer, interviewee, and we're going to move through this worksheet throughout the workshop. And then after we go through each section, I'm going to turn it over to you to spend a little bit of time in groups or pairs to spend a bit of time thinking about how you would answer these questions for the research problem that you've identified. So, Linda's already given us a brief summary of the problem. What were some of the research questions that came out of your research problem?
Okay, a couple of, and again, the interesting thing, when I started the extra program, it was to do an evidence-informed intervention. So it wasn't really a research project in the beginning, but the objectives of the project were to utilize current evidence to guide the introduction of nurse practitioners into interior health. I wanted to assess the effectiveness of an education campaign in raising public awareness and acceptance of the nurse practitioner role. And then I wanted to evaluate the impact of the NP role on outcomes for patients with multiple chronic diseases. So those were my original objectives.
And those led themselves then to some pretty specific questions, research, that were researchable questions, right? Mm-hmm. So can you tell us what kinds of questions emerged that were qualitative or quantitative or mixed? Did you have a sense of what kind of question that you had? If we focused on one of those objectives, maybe?
Yeah, even if we just look at the slide, and it might help. The second column is titled IBM, and that's really just referring to an IBM study that was done in Ontario around the integration of nurse practitioners. And one component of that study was assessing the awareness and acceptance of the nurse practitioner role. So when I found that in the literature, I thought, that looks like something we could replicate fairly easily in interior health. It wasn't going to be a really costly endeavor. We had the tool already developed and really validated through the big study in Ontario. And so when I started to look around and thought, well, the study was based on a telephone survey. So calling out to the public and asking 4 or 5 questions, or things like, have you heard of a role called a nurse practitioner? Would you be willing to see a nurse practitioner? Have you ever had care from a nurse practitioner? And what would you tell us about that care? So it was mainly quantitative, the data. What we found, we did this study, so that we went through a few steps. Again, I wasn't starting out to be a researcher, so I went to Anne-Marie Bromley, who was our research lead in interior health at the time. And I said, help me with this. Does this look like something we could do with interior health? And she said, contact BC Statistics, because they do telephone surveys across the province on an annual basis. Talk to them, and they might be able to add your questions into their telephone survey, because doing telephone surveys isn't all that simple. And so if you can find a way to get your research done with existing resources or infrastructure, and that worked out to be beautiful. So we collected 4 years of data. Our sample size was over 400 people, so a wonderfully large sample size. We then could see kind of that trend of whether or not our education and awareness was increasing the awareness of NPs. The cost, the funding source, we didn't have to go for external funding. It was only about $6,000 a year to get that data collected for us, and then we received back from BC Statistics a little summary and analysis of the data. So that was one piece, and that was a piece more looking at that awareness and acceptance.
And did you decide to pursue health authority level data, or did you do provincial level data?
Initially, I was looking at the health authority, and then I asked Tom Fulton, our CNO at the time, if he thought the CNOs provincially would want a look at the province, because every health authority was set up to have this telephone survey. And there wasn't support at that time. And I wish we had done it provincially, because I think the data would have been really rich. But we did. We have our interior health data. We did it for 4 years. We stopped at that point because we felt, okay, we're seeing the trend, the increase in awareness and acceptance. At that time, there was more national surveying going on around public awareness and acceptance, and so I couldn't really justify continuing the cost. I think it would be really interesting to do the survey again, maybe after we do this big input of nurse practitioners into the system, and just see where things are at. So that was one piece. The more qualitative work was done around the COP, or the community of practice, and interprofessional collaborative practice. And that study, I was really fortunate that a couple of things happened. When I was doing my literature review for my intervention project, I kept coming across a couple of authors, and I really liked their research, and I really liked what they were discovering. And so I would really encourage people. I just thought, you know, at the end of every article it says for more information, email the author. So I thought, well, you know what, it would be 2 minutes to send an email. So I sent an email to Alba DiCenzo, who is really just the guru of advanced practice nursing in the country, on a long shot. And the next thing I knew, I was on a conference call with Alba and 3 other Canadian researchers. I was invited out to McMaster's to sit in on one of their courses around evaluation of advanced practice nursing, and Alba has remained my mentor. And some of the studies I'm getting involved in now are really a direct result of that one email that I sent when I saw her name on an article. So I would really encourage you to do that.